This video is sponsored by Dashlane. Whenever I get on the internet these days, I'm almost always immediately overwhelmed with the feeling that social media was a mistake. Now, I'm being slightly facetious here. Social media has allowed human beings to connect with each other and share information to an unprecedented degree, which I think is amazing. Because of social media, I can instantly and effortlessly communicate with my friends and family across the country and even across the globe. We don't have to wait until the local news comes on TV to learn about what's happening in the world. These days, we often find out before they do. We can do everything from keeping up with entertainers and artists we like to planning a raid on Area 51. It's not all bad. But even though we're so connected, there's still something very distant about social media. Perhaps no matter how instant or convenient communication becomes, it will never quite replace face-to-face interaction. And it seems to me that social media sometimes really seems to bring out the worst in people. In civilized society, we've developed unspoken rules of decorum, things most everyone agrees are polite. Some of these rules are arbitrary and antiquated, and they can vary from culture to culture, but in general, most human societies value things like kindness and respect and honesty and putting others' needs before your own. Most of that tends to go out of the window on social media, at least to a larger degree than it does offline. According to a 2017 survey, 41% of American adults have experienced online harassment, and 66% have witnessed harassing behavior directed at others. Almost 1 in 5 Americans have been subjected to severe forms of online behavior, such as threats of violence and sexual harassment, and that proportion is even higher for women and people of color. Even people who are normally nice and unassuming can find themselves saying and doing some harsh things online. I'm the fucking Heiko guy, and I've even found myself being a little rude every now and then. Some people think that the lack of face-to-face interaction enables us to avoid thinking of each other as complex human beings. Instead, we're just a profile on a screen, so we don't feel the same natural empathy that we normally would. Others more cynically assert that social media has simply shined a light on the true nature of humanity. The distance and quasi-anonymity of social media means we can get away with being awful sometimes. The implication is that this is how we would all behave all the time if there weren't any social or legal consequences. I don't know which one is more accurate, but we're not going to try to figure that out in this video. Instead, we're going to think about how we might make it a little better. Hi, I'm T1J.
Follow me.
So I want to come out the gates and say that this is one of those T1J videos where I don't really propose one coherent conclusion. This is just kind of thought vomit intended to get you thinking and to get a conversation started. Okay? We good? Good. So one of the things that I try to do with this channel is to encourage people to make an effort to be decent. I think being a good person is harder than the alternative, so it often takes a little bit of effort and willpower. I'm a big advocate of personal responsibility. At the end of the day, you're in control of how you behave. And people like me can try to convince you to be kind and honest and so on, but I can't make you do it. I still think it's worth trying though. And we'd all like to think that there's this small group of maniacs who are the ones making social media difficult to enjoy, but in reality, I think it's most of us.
It's us.
Some of us just have bad days, but some of us do it habitually. However, simply hoping that people aren't shitty to each other is not going to make much of a difference in and of itself. We still have to wake up every day and interact with people both on and offline. And I'd rather we try to take some action towards making social media more pleasant and more safe for everyone. Most social media platforms do in the form of some sort of community rules that we all agree to follow when we create our accounts. For popular websites and apps, these rules usually involve things like don't harass people, don't post porn or gore, don't threaten nuclear war with North Korea. Different sites, of course, have different levels of strictness. Some will give you a ban over the smallest offense, and others have close to no rules whatsoever. The question is, do these kinds of guidelines actually work? And I'd say they probably do to some extent. Witnessing the evolution of social media has been very enlightening for someone like me who has gone on record as a staunch advocate of free expression. Of course, I understand that when you have completely free speech, some people will use that freedom to be just the worst. But many advocates will respond by saying, well, that's the price of freedom, god damn it. America. Of course, a company that owns the technology gets to make their own rules, But one of the questions that these companies have to answer is, how free should speech be on our platform? For example, if Twitter made it against the rules for users to criticize President Trump, I think most of us would consider that too large an assault on free speech, and we'd probably avoid using Twitter. But where should the line be drawn then? Twitter's a great example because neutrality and free expression have been guiding principles for the site since the beginning, arguably more so than most other well-known platforms. And like I said, when it comes to free expression, you have to take the good with the bad, and Twitter did that for a long time. But over the past few years, Twitter has received a lot of criticism for failing to address instances of threats, hate speech, bullying, harassment, and other forms of harmful communication. So Twitter has made several changes to their guidelines over the last couple of years. Whether or not you agree that these changes have been effective, it's clear that companies like Twitter are beginning to understand that there's more to this whole social media thing than just free speech. Twitter is a cautionary tale for what happens when you put free speech above everything else. The problem is when you take the good with the bad is always so much louder and more potent. And we're not just talking jerks on the internet. We're talking harmful conspiracy theories, hate speech, bigotry, and incredible threats of violence, and sometimes actual violence. When there are clear rules against this type of behavior, you're inevitably going to see less of it. You may or may not be able to think of a couple of platforms that don't have these kinds of rules, but let's just say they can be quite scary. But this, of course, requires A, clear rules to begin with that B, actually serve to combat harmful and violent speech, and C, enforcement of those rules. And the size of many of these platforms makes large-scale enforcement really hard to do, which is why most of them rely heavily on user reports. I don't think anyone expects 100% perfection, but I think it's fair to expect a reasonable response when those reports are received, especially when they become viral public discussions. Like last year, Apple, Facebook, and YouTube purged their platforms of content created by Alex Jones and his website InfoWars, which is well known for spreading false and harmful conspiracy theories. Twitter, on the other hand, initially refused to purge or ban Alex Jones, claiming he hadn't broken any of their rules. Many individuals and outlets provided examples of what appeared to be clear breaches of Twitter's conduct policy, but it wasn't until a month later when Twitter would officially ban Alex Jones and his related accounts for continuing to do what he'd been doing the whole time. YouTube has historically been known for its unclear community guidelines, especially with regard to their hate speech and harassment policy. But recently, they've actually done a fairly decent job of clearing it up on their support pages. The problem is they either don't consistently enforce their own rules, or they might just have bad rules. On the page describing YouTube's hate speech policy, there's a list of examples of, quote, hate speech not allowed on YouTube. I actually sad laughed a bit while reading this because I've seen almost all of these said nearly verbatim on YouTube, largely by people who haven't been punished. Earlier this year, Carlos Maza, a writer and host for Vox's YouTube channel, complained on Twitter about targeted harassment and hate speech he'd been receiving from Steven Crowder, a conservative YouTube commentator. You can look up the details yourself, but Crowder's comments, I think, unquestionably fit YouTube's own definitions of harassment and hate speech as written by them. However, YouTube decided not to take any action against Steven Crowder for those comments. Their main rationale seemed to be that while bigoted harassment is normally against the rules, it's okay as long as it's couched within a political opinion. And you can make an argument that this is actually reflected in the community guidelines. It says, don't post content on YouTube if the purpose of that content is to encourage violence or incite hatred against specific groups. Don't use slurs where the primary purpose is to promote hatred. This seems to imply that it's okay to use bigoted slurs against someone as long as promoting hatred is not the primary purpose of the content. And that's true of Crowder, arguably. His primary purpose ostensibly was to debate a political opinion. He just threw some racism and homophobia in there as the icing on the cake. Now again, YouTube is free to make their rules however they like. But if the goal is to curb harassment and hate speech, this is a really poorly conceived exception to the policy. And to be honest, it really explains how so much absolutely vile political content, far worse than Steven Crowder to be honest, has been allowed to remain on YouTube. Harassment and bigotry delivered as part of a political opinion does not magically cease to be harassment and bigotry. What a bad rule. So if our goal is to make social media more pleasant and more safe, making clear and proper guidelines and then enforcing those guidelines seems to be pretty important. But things like threats, harassment, and bigotry are not the only things that make social media feel unpleasant and unsafe. How do we deal with behavior that still causes us distress but doesn't rise to the level of breaking the rules? You could make stricter rules. I honestly would be interested to see how that would work out on a large scale. On my personal Discord server, which you should totally join by the way, I have pretty strict rules compared to large social media apps. It's obviously against the rules to threaten or harass people, but it's also against the rules to be an asshole in general. But it's a small community that has been cultivated by the type of content that I make, so I almost never have any real problems. I wonder what would happen if a large public platform just outright banned trolling of all kinds and being an asshole in general. There would be a lot of borderline cases and a lot of people would complain about their free speech or whatever, but maybe it would result in a friendlier and safer environment. And maybe all the people that insisted on being terrible would just go somewhere else. I don't know, I'm not sure it's been done before. Correct me if I'm wrong. I strongly believe that free speech and expression should be legally protected. You shouldn't go to jail or experience violence simply for expressing yourself, even if that speech is offensive or repugnant. But I don't think people have a right to a platform, and I don't think the right to speech implies the right to be heard. If someone chooses not to open their platform up to you, that's their prerogative. Of course, some people might have differing views about what qualifies as trolling or being an asshole. Some people think that they should be allowed to be an asshole if they think that the person they're an asshole to deserves it. Any hypothetical platform might create rules that are so restrictive that intelligent discourse is rendered impossible. But I don't know, it's hard to imagine that any useful idea can't be expressed in a respectful way. Maybe I'm missing something. Another thing that's typically not found in most platforms' community rules is holding people responsible for their followings. Of course, directly inciting your followers to harass or threaten people is usually a no-go, but figures are rarely punished for the harmful actions of their followers, even if those actions are clearly inspired by them. This is a tough issue to tackle, to be fair, because you never know what your followers are going to do, and it would be unfair to blame you for something someone else did. But like, if you make a video complaining about how awful someone is and then your audience immediately goes and harasses that person, it seems very clear that the harassment was inspired by you and probably wouldn't have happened if you didn't make the video. So there's some level of responsibility that should be attributed to you, especially if you don't make a good faith effort to discourage your community from participating in this kind of behavior. And don't get me wrong, I'm starting to understand how communities can radicalize in ways independent of the people they form around, but I'd say only certain types of creators even have an audience that would consider behaving that way in the first place. The streaming platform Twitch is notable for being one of the only platforms that directly suggests a responsibility of creators towards their communities and threatens punishment to creators themselves for the actions of their followers. It's vague, but it's something. And since we know that public figures can inspire toxic behavior in their followers, whether directly or indirectly, this is something that needs to be solved. Enforcement of these policies is usually handled by giving users tools such as the ability to block people, as well as the company itself handing out punishments such as limited access, temporary suspension, or outright bans. This mimics the way justice is carried out in most situations where there are rules or laws that people are expected to follow. You do bad thing, we make you suffer in some way. This kind of retributive punishment is designed not only as a deterrent for future offenses, but also a way of purging problematic content from the site. The effectiveness of this kind of system is limited though. In order for something like a suspension or a ban to work as a deterrent, people need to perceive losing access to the platform as an undesirable consequence they care enough to avoid. For someone like me or Alex Jones, losing access to our social media platforms is very undesirable, as social media is a significant aspect of our careers. For the average anonymous troll, it doesn't seem like they would care all that much. So one approach is to facilitate harsher consequences for these kinds of infractions. Facebook is notable for requiring users to sign up using what is presumably their real names, although some people do circumvent that. And often people are connected through their close friends and family members through Facebook's network. Facebook also encourages people to provide information on their profiles, such as what city they live in and where they work. This kind of information makes people much more likely to experience personal consequences for toxic behavior online, whether imposed by Facebook itself or by the people and groups who track you down using the information you put on the internet. A person who makes a threat of violence, for example, is likely to receive more severe consequences on Facebook than on Twitter or in a YouTube comment. What if instead of being suspended from a website, it wouldn't let you log in until you donated a certain amount to charity or even to the person you harassed? Do you think that would be a bigger deterrent? Just a hypothetical idea, by the way. I understand that money-based punishments disproportionately affect poor people, but I wonder if there were a way to implement a more close-to-home punishment, would that have a larger effect? What if you weren't allowed to log in until the offending content was shown to your employer or your grandma? You don't want to disappoint Granny and Pawpaw. Of course, these would be hard to carry out and would have varying results, but you get the wavelength I'm on. But that calls into question the efficacy and ethics of retributive justice in the first place. That's something that's been hotly debated for a long time. Some people think that bad people deserve retribution regardless of whether or not it's effective at curbing the behavior. As you might have guessed, I prefer a more utilitarian approach. I want to know what strategy is going to result in the best outcome for everyone involved. A proposed alternative is restorative or rehabilitative punishment. This approach aims to get offenders to take responsibility for their actions and to give them an opportunity to redeem themselves. And in fact, many studies show that restorative measures have a high likelihood for positive results. One meta-analysis from 2007 suggests that when compared to conventional punishment, restorative justice was not only more likely to reduce repeat offenses, but also to reduce distress in the victims. When applied to harmful behavior on social media, this can entail something like requiring offenders to complete an online sensitivity course or correspond with a counselor. A moderated dialogue could be opened up between the offender and the victim. All of these options are of course made more complicated by the fact that most popular social media platforms are free to join and new accounts can be made in literal seconds, which allows bad actors to circumvent punishment. And restorative justice specifically can only happen if victims and communities are willing to accept the possibility of their harassers being redeemed, which I admit seems kind of unlikely given the social media atmosphere. But that brings up another point: the atmosphere. If a person gets a gun and commits a crime with it, obviously that person should be held responsible for their actions. But it's still worth discussing how the gun made it so easy for them to pull it off. Likewise, on social media, people should undoubtedly be held responsible for their own behavior. The guy from the previous analogy is not holding a gun to your head and forcing you to be awful on the internet. However, we should talk about how the nature of many social media platforms encourages toxicity. Before the age of the internet, outrage is an emotion that was relatively uncommon for the average person to experience. Every now and then you'd see a news headline or hear a bit of gossip that got the blood boiling a little. Like, did you hear that Bob Johnson from down the street left his wife for a younger woman? I mean, really, who does he think he is? But life would quickly return to the mundane. And even today, it's not something we tend to experience all that often in the rare moments that we are disconnected from our devices. But as soon as we put those screens back in front of our faces, we're assaulted with plenty of opportunities to be outraged. And outrage is one of those emotions that is both addictive and contagious. To a large extent, this seems to be human nature. Humans are the only species who express moral outrage, and the only one that seems to enjoy punishing other people for perceived wrongdoings. Even our closest animal relatives, chimpanzees, don't behave this way. Punishing other people literally makes us feel good. Some researchers think that we punish others to subconsciously advertise our own righteousness, to virtue signal, as they say. There's also the fact that cooperation was no doubt an evolutionary advantage for early humans. so perhaps punishing those who we perceive as non-cooperative is hardwired into our brains. But as I implied, in everyday life, we're faced with few opportunities to actually carry this out. At least until we log onto social media, where we can be bombarded with a literally non-stop content feed that's sure to provide many justifications for us to express moral outrage. Because unlike when you're offline, you don't have to personally confront anyone face to face. If you see someone do something you don't like outside in public, you could try to shame or expose them, but there's a risk attached. Online, there's far fewer consequences. Also, in person, there's less of an opportunity for you to be socially rewarded for your heroic deeds. On social media, however, you get likes and favorites and retweets and reblogs and shares and cry laughing emojis. And like I said, this is contagious. Studies have shown that content that causes moral outrage is much more likely to be spread than other types of content. In fact, each emotional word in an online message increases the likelihood of it being shared by 20%. And of course, these companies have noticed this. They have a financial interest in presenting you with content that encourages you to engage and click and comment. So most of them have developed algorithms that fills your feed with stuff they think you're likely to engage with. And quite often, that's content that makes you mad or outraged. And so it becomes a cycle. So a large part of the responsibility for solving this problem lies on social media companies. These algorithms are significant factors in what's driving the division and toxicity online. These companies could also create technology or basic features that discourage knee-jerk outrage. What if you had to wait at least 30 seconds after reading a post before you could reply? Research has shown that taking time to cool down diminishes our inclination to be cruel to others. What if an algorithm was created that could detect when someone was being or about to be rude online and automatically lock their account for a short period? Again, these are just ideas to get the conversation started. And don't get me wrong, sometimes outrage is good and we want it to spread virally. The exposure of Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement are examples of justifiable outrage that was spread largely through social media. Or like when we all lost our shit at that terrifying CG Sonic the Hedgehog. But it can quickly get out of hand even when the outrage is legitimate. Calling someone out for saying or doing something shitty is often a reasonable thing to do. But thousands of people doing it very quickly becomes indistinguishable from bullying. I could really talk about this for a long time. There's so many different factors to consider. But ultimately, it's going to take a shift in both user behavior and technology to improve the state of social media. And it will no doubt be difficult to make either of those things happen quickly to a significant degree. But the first step is to at least talk about it. That's just me though. What do you think? Thank you for watching, and thanks to Dashlane for sponsoring this video. Dashlane is the ultimate tool to help you stay safe online. Worried about losing access to your accounts, having weak or reused passwords? Worried about hackers? Concerned about somebody monitoring your internet history? Dashlane has you covered with a myriad of tools at your disposal, such as a password manager, autofill for personal info and payment details, a VPN with country selection for safe and private browsing, and dark web monitoring to see if your data is being bought and sold on the dark web. There's a free version with basic elements, but Dashlane Premium gives you access to all these benefits at a cheaper price than other security services that have less features. Dashlane does all in one package what you would normally need 3 or 4 different tools to do. If you're not convinced yet, Dashlane has graciously allowed me to offer my viewers a free 30-day trial of Dashlane Premium. Just go ahead and click the link in the description, and you can see all of these features in action and try out Dashlane for yourself. If you like it, make sure you use the coupon code T1J at checkout for 10% off your purchase. And remember, by supporting sponsors like Dashlane, you not only get access to a great service, but you also support me and allow me to take my content to the next level.